When Waldorf announced the Quantum, I got really excited. As someone who uses hardware samplers quite a lot in his production, I have an MPC 4000 here and my beloved EMU 6400 Ultra down there. The idea of having a modern synthesizer that also has a sampling engine seemed to be like a dream come true for a sound designer such as myself. But let's start from the beginning. The Waldorf Quantum is an 8-voice polyphonic synthesizer with digital oscillators plus digital effects and an analog filter, which is very unusual if you think about it. Back in 2018, when the Quantum was announced, analog was going strong. Everyone was talking about modular synthesis and fully analog synthesizers such as the Prophet series from Dave Smith and various other incarnations from Chord. So analog was the main topic back then, and Waldorf was going kind of against the trend of the analog hype. But if you think about it, this is a completely logical step for Waldorf. Waldorf is one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer, when it comes to digital synthesis. They are coming from the PPG background. They developed the Waldorf Wave, the Waldorf Microwave. They kind of like brought wavetable synthesis into the market. So for them to have a digital synthesizer that combines both digital synthesis plus analog output stages with filtering is just like the heritage of Waldorf. And the Quantum follows that heritage from beginning to the end. The architecture of the Waldorf Quantum is very easy to understand. You have 3 oscillators that can host different kernels. So you have the classic wavetable synthesis, which you know from Waldorf. The classic wavetables are also in there, so for people that used Waldorf before, they can start right from the get-go because the classic wavetables are in there. Then you have the waveform synthesis, which is classic virtual analog. You have all these classic shapes, and then you have the particle engine, which is my favorite because it's the sampling engine that can be either sampling from multi-samples, so you can actually create multi-samples within the Waldorf, or you can import them from your SD card drive, and then you can also use them for granular synthesis. So that is, for me, the strongest point, but we'll get to that later. Then we have the resonator engine, and since the latest update, if you press both waveform and wavetable together, you also have FM synthesis. So just from the kernel engines alone, you can tell that this has to be the most complex synthesizer out there. Waldorf just nailed it with this concept. From my end. It's just amazing that you have literally every major synthesis inside the Quantum. But this is also, I think, one of the biggest flaws of the Quantum for beginners, because you can get overwhelmed quite easily. Just by the kernels alone, you are just blown away by the possibilities. And I've seen musicians getting the Quantum as their first synthesizer, and it was a mess. They called me and said, hey, listen, I don't get what is this? What is the difference between the wavetable and the waveform? And everything sounds very thin. And yeah, if you are a beginner, I wouldn't say the Quantum is the right for you. Let's get that out of the way. If you are someone that knows synthesis and understands how a subtractive synthesizer functions, then this is a dream come true. But other than that, if you're a beginner, I would go for something a little bit smaller. Waldorf has amazing beginner synthesizers like the Blofeld and their plugins. So they also have something for beginners. Like I said, 3 oscillators with different kernels or engines, I would call them. That means different synthesis types, which can then be affected and modulated by envelopes, complex modulators and LFOs. The main difference between an LFO and a complex modulator is that a complex modulator, like the name suggests, can be different shapes. And you have 2 shapes which you can blend between. So you can have a sawtooth and a sine wave, and you can create in between those shapes different types. Really, really cool. You have so many different modulators. If you go into the mod section or into the envelope section, you see that you have 6 envelopes plus over 6 LFOs. So 6 LFOs plus 6 envelopes plus the complex modulators, that's a lot. And everything can be modulated with everything, so to say. And the most brilliant part about the whole modulation scheme of the Quantum is, for me at least, the assignment process. So you have a mod button down here, and if you press that mod button, you can select the destination. Everything that turns up blue can be modulated. And that's quite a lot. So I could say, for example, I have my cutoff frequency, which is kind of like classic modulation destination. Then you have a new menu system, and you can then select the source. So then you have your LFO, for example, or it can go to the envelope, and that's really easy to do. You know, you just have your mod section, you see everything, then you select the destination, then the source, boom, you're good. That's it. And that's really, really easy to understand, and it's very fast. Like I said, you have your digital oscillators, you have your complex modulators, your LFOs, and your envelopes, and everything that you have then goes into the dual analog filter, which is mono. Even though the whole engine at first seems to be stereo, or is stereo, in fact, you don't have a true stereo filter. You have like a stereo mode, so you can have different kinds of stereo whiteness. That's not a big deal for me, because there is not always a sound that needs to be stereo. For me, if I want to have a stereo synth, I can also use the digital filters in the Quantum, and they are in fact stereo. I think we are using too many stereo sounds in our productions, and that just has a lot of different problems when it comes to phasing and stuff like that. So I don't mind, but I know that people are complaining about this. The sound of the analog filter is on the cleaner side, but it has a nice low end to it. And I think that's what Rolf Wörmann, the developer, went for, because for me, the Quantum has the magic in the way that you can combine sounds. So you have very complex sounds with a lot of different possibilities to modulate those sounds. So you can have granular synthesis combined with virtual analog synthesis and particles, all combined in that. And if you would put another characterful filter on top of that, what I would kind of guess is that you get a like bloated sound. At some point you need something that just takes away. And even though the filter is on the cleaner end, you still have different modes. You have modes like saturated, a low pass filter, 24 dB saturated, and dirty. So you can even drive more into the filter, which gives you more dirt if you want that. But I don't mind the filter. I really like it, and what I have to say is the bass response especially on pads is very great. It's a nice thick sound that you get if you are doing everything right from the start in the oscillator section. So I don't mind the filter. The Waldorf Quantum has digital effects plus digital formers. And digital formers consist of things such as drive, gain, comb filters, bit crossers, ring modulators, and the whole Waldorf filter section from older synthesizers such as the PPGs, the Nave, and the Largo. On top of the analog filter, you can also use the digital filters from Waldorf. So if you don't need the analog filtering section, you can decide to go for, in fact, the digital filter. And that gives you even more possibilities to alter the sound. And not only can you use the digital formers post the analog filter, you can even set it pre-filter, or you can just send certain sections of the oscillators to the digital former and blend that with the analog filter. Also on top, the 5 effects, which consist of stuff like delays and the tremolo and an EQ, which is great. So even more sound mangling capabilities on top of everything. So I have to say, the possibilities that you get out of the Quantum, they are just insane. Now that I showed you the architecture of the Quantum, let me tell you a little bit about the sound and the sound design workflow of the Quantum. For me, the Quantum is a modern sampler. The Quantum was especially interesting for me because it had the particles engine. To be able to use granular synthesis and sampling in an instrument that allows me to use analog filters plus virtual analog synthesis is something that I always recreated in the DAW. So I used obviously Omnisphere, and I loaded it up with other synths, and then I used the Ableton sampler, and then I combined that. Everything that I did within the DAW can be done here. And the major point for me is I don't have to look at the big screen. Using granular synthesis and all these synthesis types together felt always cumbersome because you had so many windows open, and it was just like, for me, it's sometimes not really that fun to program sounds. In the Quantum, however, it's just one part of the synthesizer. So I just go to my particles engine, I load up my samples, and then I start to play. I set different envelope types, use the LFO, and then I combine it with a virtual analog synthesis. That's just so brilliant about the Quantum because you don't think about it. You don't have those steps of setting up everything. You're loading a multi-sample, then creating another synthesizer. Then you need to be in a range where you say, okay, I stack these sounds on top. Everything is here. Everything works from here. And I have to say, granular synthesis on a computer, even though I've seen many people using it, was always kind of CPU intensive for me. And here it is just part of the engine. I don't have any audio dropouts, anything that that could interfere with my sound design process. It's all within here, and I just use it. Sound-wise, the Quantum sounds modern. Very open, very bright, doesn't have the approach of the Akai nor the EMU where you have this characterful sound to it. It lets you decide how the sound should behave. And that's where I think the Quantum sits very well in my setup. I don't like redundant setups. What's the point of having a synthesizer or a sampler that sounds just like the other? You know, it's just a double up of instruments. And that makes no sense for me, because I don't want to collect synthesizers, even though it looks a little bit like that. But actually, I try to find things that justify their place in my studio because of their uniqueness. The Quantum does that. Very modern sound, very open, very cleanish, but that is its strength. You can do really massive sounds, orchestral sounds, big, wide sounds. I love dub sounds on it. I love the pad sounds on that. And you can layer them really, really beautiful with the EMU, for example. The EMU has this kind of like fat sound, very American sound. Here I am an EMU, and if you put a pad on that, it's just very wide and very big. But then you can use the Quantum on top of that or below, because you have that nice low end, which is very distinct and very precise. You can layer those sounds, and that's where I see the Quantum in my studio. It's just one of the sounds that I use. I told you at the beginning that the Quantum was an 8-voice polyphonic synthesizer. However, this is not true anymore. With version 3.0, the Quantum got actually the voice allocation from the Iridium. Because the Iridium and the Quantum share the same processor, they can in fact be the same synthesizer in some areas. So now the Quantum has a 16-voice polyphonic mode, which can also be stereo. So you don't lose the capabilities of the Iridium anymore. You have your 16 voices within that. But what's the most interesting part about this is that Rolf developed voice allocations. So either you can just use 16 voices digital, which are stereo then, or, which I love, you can use both the 8 analog voices, so the voices that run through the analog filter, plus 8 more voices on top of that, which are digital. And you can blend between those two types of voices, which makes it even more interesting, because on the one hand you have analog filtering that is going through certain types of saturation and distortion, and on top of that you have the digital voices, which can be stereo. And you can play them either in unison mode or alternating mode, or you can combine different ways of doing that. And this is something I never seen in a synthesizer before, and it sounds really unique, because you can hear what the analog filter is doing to the sound. You get a little bit more dirt, a little bit more griminess in comparison to the complete digital filter, even though both are very clean. But that gives you an even more distinct sound and tone to it. You can really play around with those different settings, and you will find that some sounds that you've played before will sound different when using voice allocations. On top of that, 16 voices are 16 voices. I mean, that's a great starting point for some very wide or longer pads. If you're into ambient and drone music, you know what I mean by that. Sometimes, like when there's when voices are choking, even though you have an 8-voice polyphonic synthesizer, having the double amount is just a blessing. We talked a lot about the architecture of the Quantum and the development process, and actually what it means for Waldorf. The Quantum is a new platform that was developed for many synthesizers to come. And that's what Rolf and the whole Waldorf team are communicating very openly. You know, they started with the Quantum, and then they followed up with the Iridium and the Iridium keyboard. And I think the whole development process is very fair to the customer, because many people were afraid that when the Iridium came out, that the Quantum would be discontinued or that it would become obsolete. In fact, Rolf always tried to implement all the features from the Iridium into the Quantum and vice versa. It was never the case that some Waldorf users would be let down when they bought the Quantum, and why would they? I mean, the Quantum is the flagship model and it cost a lot of money. Even though many people were afraid of that, it took a little while, which is true because Rolf is most of the time a one-man show, and Corona made it even worse for developers to source materials and components, which took most of the time back then, and there wasn't much time to develop software updates. With the new lineup from Waldorf, especially with the Iridium keyboard, I think you can see where Waldorf is going now. The whole idea of making the Quantum platform or the Quantum/Iridium platform to be a synthesizers and sound designers' dream now also should come to the keyboard player with the polyphonic aftertouch. The polyphonic aftertouch for me is the next step in the development of this platform because it makes sense. You have 40 modulation slots in the Iridium and the Quantum. You can use a lot of different sound capabilities with that. And to be able to play that across the whole keyboard is just a new way of interacting with the synthesizer. I think that's a brilliant decision because it actually separates the Quantum and Iridium lineup even more from classic approaches of synthesizers. This is not a classic approach of a synthesizer. It is a synthesizer for the 21st century. And I really admire Waldorf for going a different route and a different way, even though there are sometimes some hurdles that you need to overcome. But from my point, I really enjoy what Waldorf did with the Quantum. And you can see that now. There are now synthesizers coming out that are very similar to the Quantum, if you think about it, right? There are now very complex digital synthesizers with very different approaches to digital synthesis, and I like that. The big elephant in the room, obviously, is the Mark II. What's happening now to the Quantum, and what do I think of the Mark II? Like I told you, Waldorf is going a different route. They want to have interactive synthesizers that talk to you in a different way and that are very complex and give you different sounds. And the polyphonic aftertouch keyboard is just the logical conclusion. And to add that to the Quantum makes a whole lot of sense. If you are someone that doesn't use polyphonic aftertouch, and I can say that these are many people, the Mark I is still the synthesizer to go for me. The Mark II is for people that really like to play. Keyboard players that need the polyphonic aftertouch in order to make their sound even more expressive. And you see that guys like Hans Zimmer and other film composers, they love the Quantum for what it does. And to be able to use MPE sounds and all those different modulation capabilities makes for them a whole lot of sense. The sample RAM, yeah, I think it's like 63 gigs or 59 gigs. I don't mind. I use my sounds from the SD card and load them up. That's just what I do, and I never had any issues with the sampling memory. I don't see the point there. So for me, the Quantum Mark II is a logical conclusion, but it doesn't make the Quantum Mark I an inferior synthesizer. They are just different approaches. Now that I raved about the Quantum so much, is there anything that I don't like? Not really, but there are 2 points that I would like to mention. First, I would love to see a 96 kilohertz version of the Waldorf Quantum. Right now, the sampling engine and the digital engine runs at 44.1 kilohertz. That seems to me right now to be the only bottleneck of that system. People would say now, hey, what the heck? It's 44.1, we are recording in 44.1 or 48 kilohertz. What's the big deal? That's true. I wouldn't say for recording 96 kilohertz is necessary. However, when you're doing sound design and modulations and synthesis, the step up from 44.1 to 96 kilohertz leads to more resolution and a better aliasing between the sounds. And I heard that with the G2, which I have from 2003. That is 96 kilohertz, and it holds up very well against modern synthesizers, both digital and analog, and also Roland's ACB technology, which I really like from the sound point. It's 96 kilohertz. It makes a lot of sense to use 96 kilohertz. One thing that I would really like to see, I know it's a nerdy subject, but I think it makes total sense for the Quantum and Iridium lineup, is to have full CV controls. So, for example, like having 8 CV inputs and 8 CV outputs would make the Iridium and the Quantum like the centerpiece for every modular nerd. Because I worked with a Moog Voyager now, and the Moog Voyager, for example, has inputs and outputs for the modular realm, and that is just a game changer for me. And I think that the same is true for the Quantum. Just think about it, you know, using the complex modulators and the LFOs and the envelopes in the modular world, you know, sending them out into my modular rig, and then just, for example, use some other LFOs out of the modular stuff back into my back as a modulation source. That could be like an amazing setup, you know, like combining Quantum and modular setups. That's just like the next step for me. These are my 2 main points: having a 96 kilohertz engine plus a full CV input and output setup. I would love to see that. Apart from that, the Quantum is the synthesizer that I will never part with. I like the sound, I love the layout, plus the build quality. I haven't talked about that one. The build quality is just breathtaking in some parts. I mean, I could really bang against those knobs and nothing would really happen. The design is also really, really cool. That's my review of the Quantum synthesizer. I hope you enjoyed that video, and if you have any questions, as always, please write them down in the comment section below. And now I play some sounds from the Quantum.